What if Iran's most dangerous weapon was never the missile itself? Thousands of drones and dozens of launch sites behave like one machine? That question changes everything. Because for months, Iran built its strategy around a simple mathematical bet. America could intercept almost anything. Israel could intercept almost anything. Gulf air defenses could intercept almost anything. But nobody could intercept everything. So Iran did not need every missile to hit. It only needed enough missiles to arrive at once. Enough drones from one direction. Enough ballistic missiles from another. Enough cruise missiles moving low across the horizon. Something would get through. And when it did, the damage would not be measured in percentages. It would be measured in dead soldiers, closed ports, and an insurance market that suddenly decided the Strait of Hormuz was too dangerous to cross. That was the strategy. And for a while, it made sense. By early April, the United Arab Emirates alone had reportedly intercepted more than 537 ballistic missiles, more than 200 drones, and dozens of cruise missiles launched from Iranian territory. The numbers were enormous. But here's the contradiction. The more missiles Iran fired, the more obvious its real vulnerability became. Behind every launch is a command decision. Behind every command decision is a communications network. And behind every communications network is a headquarters somewhere that believes it is still in control. That is where the story of the ninth night begins. Not with a missile. Look at the region from above. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow corridor connecting the Persian Gulf to the wider world, carrying a significant share of global energy trade. To the north sits Iran. And between them, a few miles of water capable of affecting fuel prices thousands of miles away. Iran understood the geography. It did not need to defeat the American military everywhere. It needed to make this narrow corridor dangerous enough that shipping companies, tanker crews, and insurance firms would make the decision for everyone else. That was the genius of the strategy. And its weakness. Because the same logic that made Iran's swarm dangerous also made its command infrastructure at target. When the ninth night of American strikes arrived, the campaign was no longer simply hunting missiles. Command centers, air defense networks, coastal surveillance, missile launch areas, drone facilities, communications nodes. But here's the problem. Iran loses weapons if you destroy enough command infrastructure. The ability to use its remaining weapons together. That is a completely different kind of battlefield. Imagine a radar screen in a command center. Normally, an officer sees multiple threats developing simultaneously. One launch site reports activity. Another confirms a target. A third receives the timing order. Then the communications network begins to disappear. One node goes silent. Then another. A relay station stops transmitting. A command center loses contact with subordinate units. The missiles are still there. The drones are still there. But the orchestra has lost its conductor. And that is the first major revelation of this war. A military does not lose its power only when its weapons are destroyed. Sometimes it loses its power when its weapons can no longer act as one force. That is what the ninth night was designed to test. For 9 consecutive nights, American strikes increasingly focused on the infrastructure that allowed Iran to coordinate pressure across multiple domains. The campaign moved from individual targets toward a larger system. Air, sea, logistics. The visible explosions were only the surface. Underneath them was a battle over whether Iran could still organize a synchronized response. Then came the economic battlefield. 8 tanker disabled near an Iranian oil terminal. Commercial vessels redirected. Energy infrastructure under pressure. And facilities providing water to civilian populations damaged. During the broader campaign, This is where the war becomes more complicated than a simple story of missiles versus air defenses, because military power depends on infrastructure. A missile battery needs fuel. A drone needs electricity. A command center needs communications. A port needs roads. A city needs water. And a state under pressure needs revenue. The deeper the campaign goes. Iran's strategy did not need to destroy American defenses to create economic damage. A tanker operator does not ask whether Iran can launch 1,000 drones. The operator asks a simpler question: can my ship be hit? Even slightly. Insurance costs rise. Routes change. Cargoes wait. Markets react. The strait can become economically disrupted without Iran ever achieving military control of it. That is why the swarm strategy cannot be judged only by interception numbers. A missile intercepted is a military success, but a tanker that never sails is an economic consequence. And those two battles can produce completely different outcomes. Now look at the American side. The United States has invested heavily in layered defense. Radar, fighter aircraft, surface minus-to-minus air missiles, electronic warfare, allied systems, interceptors. The purpose is to stop threats before they reach their targets. But defense has an inherent problem. It is reactive. The attacker chooses the direction. The attacker decides how many weapons to launch. And the defender has to respond to all of them. That is exactly the mathematical trap Iran was trying to create. But America found another way to change the equation. Instead of asking, how many missiles can we intercept? The question became, how many missiles can Iran still coordinate? That is the turning point. Because the battlefield has moved. The ninth night was not simply another night of airstrikes. It was an attempt to attack the architecture of saturation itself. And that raises the question that leads into the deeper war. If Iran still has missiles, if Iran still has drones, then what exactly has been defeated? The answer may be hidden inside the space between two launches. Because a weapon sitting in a bunker is potential power. A weapon launched at the wrong time is limited power. But 100 weapons arriving simultaneously from multiple directions? That is strategic power. And the battle now is increasingly about whether Iran can rebuild that coordination faster than American intelligence can find it. That is where the ninth night ends. And where the real war begins. Everyone thinks this war is about missiles and air defenses. But the real war is about coordination. The missile is no longer the center of the story. And once you see the war that way, the events of the ninth night look completely different. Iran's original strategy depended on saturation. The United States appears to be pursuing something else. Disintegration. Not necessarily destroying every weapon. Not necessarily eliminating every launch site. But breaking the connections that turn individual weapons into a synchronized attack. That is the invisible battlefield. And it is far more difficult to measure than a crater on a satellite image. A destroyed missile launcher is easy to photograph. A command relationship that no longer functions is not. A communications network can be damaged. Then partially repaired. A headquarters can be abandoned. Then replaced. A surviving officer can improvise. A launch crew can act independently. And this creates the central contradiction of the next phase. The more America attacks Iran's command structure, the less coherent Iran's response may become. But the less coherent Iran becomes, the harder it may be to predict what individual units will do. A centralized military can be dangerous. A fragmented military can be dangerous in a different way. Because fragmentation creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is exactly what makes escalation difficult to control. Imagine the map again. A missile launches from one location. No one knows whether it was centrally ordered. Another drone appears. Was it part of a coordinated attack? Or was it a local commander acting independently? 8 Anchor is threatened. Was that a strategic decision? Or an isolated operation? The weapons may be fewer, but the decision-making becomes harder to read. This is why the American campaign cannot simply measure success by the number of missiles intercepted. The real question is whether Iran can still make strategic decisions as a unified military system. The Strait of Hormuz does not need to be physically closed to create global consequences. It only needs to become uncertain. A ship approaches. A company calculates the cost. A government watches oil prices. A refinery waits for deliveries. Thousands of miles away, traders react before military analysts can even determine what happened. That is the invisible connection. A drone launched in Iran. 8 Anchor delayed in the Gulf. A higher insurance premium in London. A higher energy cost somewhere else. One military decision becomes an economic chain reaction. The lesson here is that modern warfare does not move in straight lines. It moves through systems. Military pressure affects energy. Energy affects economics. Economics affects politics. And the cycle begins again. This is why Iran's residual capability still matters, even if its large-scale saturation strategy has been degraded. It may not need to restore the entire machine. It may only need enough capability to keep the risk alive. One missile. One drone. One damaged tanker. One unexploded mine. The goal is no longer necessarily to overwhelm the defense network. The goal may be to convince everyone that the risk of normal operations remains unacceptable. That is a much lower threshold, and it creates a serious problem for Washington. Because destroying the swarm may not reopen the strait. The military threat can decline while the economic threat survives. That is the contradiction. America can win the air defense battle and still face an economic problem. Iran can lose much of its military coordination and still influence global shipping. Neither side needs total victory to impose costs on the other. And that is why the next phase may be even more important than the ninth night. The battlefield is becoming a race between reconstruction and detection. Iran will try to rebuild. New command posts. New communication links. Alternative launch procedures. Smaller independent units. Perhaps simpler attacks that require less centralized coordination. America will try to find those adaptations before they become operational. This creates a completely different kind of arms race. Not bomb versus bunker. Not missile versus interceptor. Adaptation versus adaptation. The question becomes, can Iran rebuild its coordination network faster than American intelligence can identify and disrupt it? Because if the answer is yes, the swarm may return in a different form. Not necessarily thousands of weapons arriving simultaneously. Perhaps smaller waves. Multiple independent attacks. Distributed launch sites. Less sophisticated. Harder to predict. And that could create a new strategic problem. But every strike also teaches the defender something. Iran now knows what America prioritizes. It knows that command centers matter. It knows communications matter. It knows logistics matter. It knows infrastructure can be targeted. The next Iranian strategy will be shaped by those lessons. And that is the paradox of modern warfare. Every successful strike can also become intelligence for the enemy. The weapon that destroys today's system can help build tomorrow's system. That is why no military campaign should be judged only by what it destroys. The deeper question is what the enemy learns. Now zoom out. The consequences extend far beyond Iran. The degradation of Iranian capabilities could reduce one category of threat while increasing another. For Gulf states, the destruction of launch infrastructure may provide temporary relief, but the economic dependence on the strait remains. For Europe and Asia. For Washington, the problem is strategic endurance. How long can military pressure continue before economic and political costs begin to outweigh the gains? And for Tehran, the calculation is even more complicated. The country must decide whether to preserve surviving military capability or spend it, whether to continue attacking shipping or reduce pressure, whether to rebuild centralized command or distribute authority. Every option carries risk. That is the real strategic battlefield. Not the missile. The decision. Not the drone. Not the explosion. The calculation that happens before it. And perhaps the most important lesson from the Ninth Night is that saturation warfare has a hidden requirement. You need more coordination than your enemy can destroy. That is a much harder problem. Because missiles can be manufactured, drones can be assembled, but command networks must survive. Communications must remain connected. Officers must trust the information they receive. And the entire system must continue functioning while the enemy is actively hunting it. That is why the Ninth Night may represent a strategic turning point without necessarily being a decisive victory. Iran's swarm strategy has been pressured. Its coordination architecture appears to have been targeted. But the underlying logic of the strategy has not disappeared. It has simply entered a new phase. And now comes the dangerous question. What happens when a military that can no longer coordinate a massive attack begins searching for smaller ways to create the same strategic effect? Because the next battle may not look like the last one. It may be quieter, more distributed, more ambiguous, and potentially harder to attribute. That is where the global consequences become serious. The Strait of Hormuz could remain economically disrupted, even as missile attacks decline. Oil markets could remain nervous even as interception rates improve. And governments could remain under pressure even when the battlefield appears quieter. The war would no longer be about whether Iran can overwhelm defenses. It would be about whether Iran can keep the world uncertain enough to make normal life more expensive. That is a different kind of warfare, and it may be the one that lasts the longest. The question is no longer whether Iran has enough missiles to overwhelm American defenses. The real question is whether Iran can rebuild the invisible system that turns individual weapons into strategic power before the United States finds and dismantles it again. Because in modern warfare, the most dangerous weapon may not be the one that explodes. It may be the network that tells 1,000 weapons when to arrive. So here is the question. Do you believe future wars will be decided by who has more weapons or by who can keep their systems connected long enough to use them?